There is a dry lake bed in the far southwest of New South Wales that looks, from the road, like the end of the world. The water has been gone for at least 15,000 years. What remains is a flat, pale expanse of cracked clay and wind-blown sand stretching to the horizon in every direction, ringed on its western edge by a long crescent of eroded dunes that glow a deep orange in the afternoon light. The dunes are called the Walls of China, a name given by Chinese laborers who worked the surrounding sheep stations in the 19th century and saw in those pale curved formations a resemblance to the Great Wall of their homeland. It is not a landscape that suggests importance at first glance. It is a landscape that has produced, since scientists first began examining it seriously in the 1960s, a sequence of findings that have individually and collectively rewritten what the world understood about the origins and antiquity of modern human beings. Not revised it at the margins. Rewritten it. The oldest known human remains ever found in Australia were found at Lake Mungo. The oldest evidence of human ritual behavior anywhere on Earth was found at Lake Mungo. The oldest human DNA ever recovered from Australian skeletal remains came from Lake Mungo, and the genetic results of that DNA analysis produced a finding so unexpected, so difficult to fit into the existing model of human prehistory, that the scientific establishment spent nearly 2 decades arguing about whether the technology had made an error rather than accepting what the result was telling them. It was not an error. What the scientists found at Lake Mungo has changed the human story at its most fundamental level. And it has done so quietly, incrementally, and with very little of the public attention it deserves. This is the full account of what was found, and what it means. If you are new here, this channel covers Australian history and ancient country that most people were never properly taught. Subscribe now and let me know in the comments below what you already knew about Lake Mungo before watching this video today. Let us start with the place itself. Because Lake Mungo is not simply a dry lake bed. It is a natural archive of an almost unparalleled completeness, and understanding what kind of archive it is explains why it has produced the findings it has. Lake Mungo is one of a chain of ancient lakes known collectively as the Willandra Lakes system, a series of interconnected lake basins in the semi-arid country of western New South Wales that were filled by overflow from the Lachlan River system during wetter periods in the past. The lakes are old. The oldest sediments at the base of the system date to around 100,000 years. The most recent period of significant water, the phase that concerns us most in the context of the discoveries, lasted from roughly 50,000 years ago to about 15,000 years ago. During that wet phase, Lake Mungo was a real lake, full of fresh water, ringed by vegetation, supporting fish, shellfish, waterfowl, and the animals that came to drink from its edges. It was in the landscape of western New South Wales, a place of extraordinary abundance relative to the surrounding country. And people were there. They were there from the beginning of the wet phase, or close enough to the beginning that the difference is not meaningful in human terms. They lived on the lake's shores. They fished. They gathered shellfish. They hunted the animals that came to the water. They buried their dead with careful ceremony. They lived full human lives at the edge of that ancient water for tens of thousands of years. And then the lake dried up. As the climate shifted and the water withdrew, the wind took over. The shoreline sediments, no longer held in place by water and vegetation, began to move. The dunes that formed along the western edge of the lake, driven by the prevailing westerly winds, accumulated the debris of the human occupation that had taken place on the shores. Hearth charcoal, shellfish middens, animal bones, and human remains. All of it was covered by accumulating sand and preserved in the dry, stable conditions of the arid interior for 15,000 years, until the wind started to reveal it again. The same wind that built the dunes has been slowly eroding their surfaces for thousands of years, working from the outside inward. As the outer layers of the dune erode, the older material that was buried deeper within begins to emerge at the surface. Bones that have been sealed in stable dry sediment for tens of thousands of years work their way toward the surface over centuries of gradual erosion, and eventually emerge into the light. This is how Lake Mungo reveals its secrets. Not through excavation. Through natural exposure. The dunes are a slow-moving archive that has been opening itself to the surface at its own pace, bringing forward what was buried within it in a sequence determined by the physics of wind erosion. And in 1968, a geologist named Jim Bowler, working in the region as part of a study of ancient lake systems in the Murray-Darling Basin, noticed something eroding out of the walls of China. Human remains. Now let us talk about what was found. Because the sequence of discoveries at Lake Mungo spans more than 50 years and each major finding built on and extended what came before it. The first significant discovery came in 1968 when Jim Bowler found the fragmentary remains of a cremated human burial eroding from the dune surface. The remains were collected and taken to the Australian National University for analysis. They were identified as the remains of a young adult, determined from skeletal characteristics to most likely be female. She had been cremated, her bones had been deliberately broken, and the fragments had been gathered and buried in a small pit in the ground. This was Mungo Lady, the oldest known human cremation in the world. When she was dated, the result was extraordinary. The remains of Mungo Lady were dated to approximately 42,000 years ago. At the time of that finding, in the early 1970s, the oldest evidence of ritual mortuary behavior anywhere in the world outside Australia was considerably more recent. Cremation as a deliberate practice, the understanding that the dead required specific treatment, the act of gathering and burying the burned remains in a prepared location, these are not the behaviors of beings at the beginning of symbolic thought. They are the behaviors of fully modern humans operating within a cultural framework that recognized the significance of death and responded to it with ceremony. 42,000 years ago. In western New South Wales. The finding placed Australia at the center of the story of modern human behavior in a way that the existing global framework of human prehistory had not anticipated. The dominant model of human cognitive development at the time of the discovery placed the emergence of behavioral modernity, the capacity for symbolic thought, ritual behavior, and complex cultural practice, primarily in Europe and Africa, with Australia understood as a relatively recent destination in the global dispersal of modern humans. Mungo Lady did not fit that model. She predated the European evidence of comparable behavior by a margin that required either revising the model or explaining the Australian evidence as an anomaly. The scientific establishment, with some exceptions, chose to explain it as an anomaly or to keep the dating under review for longer than the evidence warranted. Then Jim Bowler found something else. In 1974, 6 years after his initial discovery, Bowler was working the same section of the dune when he noticed another exposure in the eroding surface. A different set of remains. More complete this time. A skeleton, partially articulated, lying in a deliberately prepared grave, with the hands folded and placed in the lap and the body oriented carefully in the landscape. This was Mungo Man, the oldest known human burial in the world. Dated eventually to approximately 42,000 years ago, the same broad period as Mungo Lady. A man who had lived to a relatively old age, who had suffered from severe arthritis in his right arm that would have significantly limited his ability to work and to hunt, and who had been cared for by the people around him well enough and long enough to survive to old age with that disability. The care of the disabled. The deliberate burial of the dead in a prepared grave with the body oriented and the hands positioned. The cremation and reburial of Mungo Lady. These are not the incidental traces of human occupation. They are evidence of a moral and cultural framework operating at a level of complexity that the existing model of human prehistory associated with a much more recent period. Both of them. 42,000 years ago. In Australia. The implications were significant and uncomfortable for a scientific establishment committed to a model in which this level of human sophistication arrived in Australia relatively late in the global story. And then the DNA analysis was conducted. In 1999, a research team led by Dr. Greg Adcock from the Australian National University extracted ancient DNA from the skeletal remains of Mungo Man and analyzed the mitochondrial DNA recovered from the sample. Mitochondrial DNA is passed from mother to child and accumulates mutations at a relatively predictable rate over time, making it useful for tracing maternal lineages through deep time. The result of the analysis was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2001. It was one of the most unexpected findings in the history of human genetics. The mitochondrial DNA recovered from Mungo Man did not match any known human mitochondrial lineage. Not the lineages that trace back to the African origins of modern humans. Not the lineages found in any modern Aboriginal Australian population. Not any sequence in any reference database of human mitochondrial DNA collected from populations across the globe. Mungo Man's DNA was unlike anything that exists in any living human being on Earth today. The interpretation proposed by Adcock and his colleagues was that Mungo Man represented an early lineage of anatomically modern humans that had diverged from the ancestors of all living humans before the lineage that gave rise to all currently living people had established its dominance. A branch of the modern human family tree that was fully human in the anatomical sense, but that had diverged from the main trunk of human genetic history early enough that it left no mitochondrial descendants in the modern gene pool. What this would mean, if the interpretation is correct, is that the human story in Australia does not fit into a simple model of recent arrival and continuous descent from a single founding population. It suggests instead a picture of human presence in Australia that is more complex, more ancient, and more varied than any previous model had proposed. A picture in which early modern humans may have reached Australia through multiple dispersal events, in which lineages that no longer exist in the living population may have been present here for tens of thousands of years, and in which the conventional out-of-Africa model of human dispersal requires revision in its details if not in its broad outlines. The scientific establishment's response to the Adcock findings was prolonged skepticism. Technical objections were raised about the reliability of ancient DNA analysis at that period, the possibility of contamination, and the statistical confidence of the lineage assignment. These objections were not entirely without merit. Ancient DNA analysis in 2001 was technically less reliable than it subsequently became, and the concerns about contamination were real methodological challenges. But the skepticism lasted longer than the technical objections could fully justify. The results continued to be described as uncertain or requiring further confirmation for nearly 2 decades after their publication, during which time ancient DNA technology improved dramatically and studies conducted at many other sites were producing results that were accepted with considerably less resistance. The Mungo Man DNA results have not been replicated in subsequent analyses, partly because of restrictions on further sampling of the remains and partly because of the technical challenges of the sample. What has not happened is a clear demonstration that the original results were simply wrong. They remain in the scientific literature as published, disputed but not refuted. The traditional custodians of Lake Mungo, the Muthi Muthi, Njayampa, and Pakantiai peoples, whose country encompasses the Willandra Lakes region, have their own understanding of who Mungo Man and Mungo Lady were. In the knowledge systems of the traditional owners, the ancient people whose remains have been found at Lake Mungo are ancestors. Direct ancestors, in the spiritual and cultural sense if not necessarily in the purely genealogical sense, of the people who care for this country today. The return of the remains of both Mungo Lady and Mungo Man to the care of the traditional owners, which took place in 2017 after decades of negotiation, was a significant moment in the relationship between Australian science and the Aboriginal communities whose cultural heritage had been treated as scientific material without adequate consultation for most of the 20th century. The remains are now held by the traditional owners, stored in a keeping place on country, and will eventually be reburied when the traditional owners determine that the time and the conditions are right. Their story, the story encoded in their bones and in the sediment around them, is not the property of any scientific institution. It is the story of this country, held by the people whose country it is. The findings from Lake Mungo have not stopped with the human remains. The broader archaeological and paleoenvironmental record preserved in the Willandra Lakes system has been the subject of sustained scientific investigation since the 1960s, and each decade of that investigation has added to the picture of what this landscape contains. The megafauna question is one of the most significant and most contested areas of research connected to the site. The Willandra Lakes system contains fossil remains of the large animals that lived in this part of Australia during the period of human occupation documented at Lake Mungo. Diprotodon, the largest marsupial that ever lived, the size of a modern rhinoceros. Procoptodon, the giant short-faced kangaroo, twice the size of modern kangaroos. Thylacoleo, the marsupial lion. Genyornis, the giant flightless bird. These animals were all present in the landscape during the period when the earliest humans at Lake Mungo were living on the lake shores. And they all became extinct. The timing of their extinction has been one of the most fiercely debated questions in Australian archaeology and paleontology for decades. The question at the center of the debate is whether human hunting was the primary cause of the megafauna extinctions, whether climate change drove the extinctions independently of human presence, or whether some combination of both factors was responsible. The evidence from the Willandra Lakes system, and from Lake Mungo specifically, has been central to this debate because it provides one of the best records anywhere in Australia of the temporal overlap between human presence and the period of megafauna extinction. The dating of both the human occupation evidence and the megafauna fossil record within the same sedimentary system allows researchers to assess the chronological relationship between them with more precision than is possible at most other sites. The current consensus, which has been converging over the last decade as dating technology has improved and the dataset has grown, is that the megafauna extinctions in Australia occurred over an extended period and involved the interaction of multiple stressors, with human hunting pressure likely playing a significant role in pushing already stressed populations into collapse. At Lake Mungo, there is no evidence of direct megafauna hunting by the earliest human occupants of the site. The faunal remains in the earliest cultural deposits are dominated by fish, shellfish, and smaller mammals. But the megafauna were present in the broader landscape during the same period, and their disappearance from the regional fossil record occurs within the timeframe of human occupation at the site. The relationship between the people of Lake Mungo and the giant animals that shared their landscape is not fully resolved. It may never be fully resolved. But the evidence from this site continues to be among the most important in the global effort to understand one of the most significant ecological transformations in the history of this planet. The paleoclimate record preserved in the lake sediments is another area where the Willandra Lakes system has produced findings that extend well beyond the site itself. The sediment cores and exposed stratigraphic sections of the ancient lake systems contain a detailed record of climate change across this part of Australia spanning 100,000 years. The chemical composition of the sediments, the types of pollen preserved within them, the size and nature of the dune deposits, and the characteristics of the ancient lake shoreline features all carry information about the temperature, rainfall, wind patterns, and vegetation cover of the landscape at different points in the past. That record has been read with increasing sophistication as the analytical tools available to paleoclimate researchers have improved, and it has produced a picture of climate variability in southeastern Australia over the last 100,000 years that is significantly more detailed and more nuanced than was previously available. The period of human occupation at Lake Mungo, from approximately 50,000 years ago to the drying of the lake around 15,000 years ago, was not a period of stable, favorable conditions. The climate record shows considerable variability within that period, including extended dry phases that reduced the lake level significantly and compressed the habitable environment around its shores. The people who lived at Lake Mungo across those tens of thousands of years were not occupying a static landscape. They were adapting, generation after generation, to a landscape that was itself changing around them. Their presence through that variability is evidence not just of how long they were here but of how capable they were. The capacity to maintain a viable community in a landscape that alternated between abundant lake shore resources and extended dry phases requiring different strategies and different movements across country is not a simple or automatic thing. It reflects the same depth of environmental knowledge and cultural adaptability that the evidence of ritual behavior in the burial and cremation record suggests. The people of Lake Mungo were not simply the oldest Australians in the temporal sense. They were sophisticated, culturally complex, environmentally knowledgeable people whose lives at the edge of that ancient lake were full lives in every sense that matters. What the science has revealed, finding by finding across more than 50 years of research, is a picture of those lives that is still becoming clearer. The oldest cremation, the oldest prepared burial, the DNA that does not match anything living, the megafauna that disappeared as these people arrived, the climate record of a landscape that changed around them while they stayed. Each of those findings would be significant alone. Together, at the same site, they form something that has not been adequately described in any public account. They form the oldest and most complete record of modern human life anywhere on Earth outside Africa. Not a peripheral record. Not a recently settled outpost of the human story. The center of it. The place where the earliest behavioral modernity is documented. The place where the care of the dead, the recognition of ceremony, and the capacity to sustain community through environmental change are all preserved together in a single sedimentary archive. Lake Mungo is not a dry lake bed at the edge of the world. It is the closest thing that science has yet found to the beginning of the world as we know it. The world in which human beings recognize each other as beings worthy of care, of ceremony, of deliberate burial in the ground with the hands folded and the body oriented in the landscape. That world began here, in the dry country of western New South Wales, 42,000 years ago or more. And the people whose country it is have known that, in their own terms, for the entire time. If this changed how you think about Lake Mungo and Australia's ancient past, leave a comment below and subscribe for more Australian history that most people were never properly taught.